The snow began to fall just beyond Calais, thin at first, then thickening into a relentless white curtain that pressed against the windows of the night express. Inside the first-class carriage, velvet seats glowed beneath brass lamps, and crystal glasses chimed faintly with the rhythm of the rails. The journey to Paris had promised to be uneventful and swift crossing of the Channel, a warm dining car, a quiet night's rest, but as the train cut deeper into the countryside, the storm closed around it like a fist. Shortly after midnight, the train shuddered and groaned to a halt. At first, the passengers assumed a minor delay. Snowdrifts were common this time of year. The conductor passed briskly through the corridor, assuring all that the engine would resume shortly. Yet minutes turned to half an hour, and the silence grew oppressive. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the carriage windows as though testing their strength. It was then that the first scream rang out. It came from the far end of the first-class sleeper carriage, sharp and terrified, slicing through the murmur of speculation. Doors opened. Heads emerged into the narrow corridor. The conductor hurried toward compartment 7, from which the cry had originated. The door would not open. It was locked from within. The passenger assigned to compartment 7 was a man of some notoriety, a wealthy art dealer returning from London. He had boarded alone, carrying only a leather valise and a polished ebony cane with a silver wolf's head carved into its handle. He had dined lightly, spoken to no one at length, and retired early. The conductor knocked firmly. No response. He called the man's name. Silence. With the assistance of 2 gentlemen from neighboring compartments, he forced the door. The scene within was dreadful in its stillness. The art dealer lay sprawled across the narrow berth, one hand dangling toward the floor, fingers stiff. His eyes stared at nothing. A dark stain spread across his shirt front, soaking into the crisp linen. A single, precise wound marked his chest. There was no weapon in sight. The window was sealed shut, frosted over by the cold. The ventilation grate was undisturbed. The small wash-basin's tap dripped faintly, though it had been turned off before. The only other object out of place was a scatter of white powder across the carpet, fine, crystalline, like crushed sugar or salt spilled in a narrow line leading from the door to the edge of the bed. But the door had been locked from the inside. The conductor stepped back, blanching. One of the gentlemen muttered a prayer. The lady who had screamed she had glimpsed the body through the half-open door was led away trembling. The train engineer soon confirmed the worst. The snowdrifts were too heavy. The express would remain stranded until morning, perhaps longer. Telegraph lines were down. They were alone on the frozen stretch of countryside, miles from the nearest station. No one could have left the compartment. No one could have entered. Yet the man was unmistakably dead. The conductor examined the lock. It was a simple interior bolt, still firmly slid into place. The key rested on the small writing desk beneath the mirror. The mirror itself bore a faint smear, as though someone had brushed against it with a gloved hand. The passengers were assembled in the dining car, pale and whispering. A doctor traveling second class confirmed the obvious. Death had been swift, the wound delivered with accuracy and force. A slender blade, perhaps, but none could be found in the compartment or corridor. Then came the matter of the white powder. The conductor returned with a small envelope, carefully scooping some of the substance into it. It was scattered deliberately, he insisted, not spilled by accident. One of the passengers, professor of chemistry, as it happened, examined a pinch of it between his fingers. He sniffed cautiously. Salt, he declared after a moment. Ordinary table salt. A ripple of confusion passed through the group. Salt on a train? In a locked compartment? There was no overturned shaker. No meal tray had been brought since the man retired. The salt lay in a deliberate trail, leading from the door to the bed, stopping precisely at the victim's hand. It seemed meaningless, childish even, and yet it was the only sign that something extraordinary had occurred. Outside, the snow piled higher against the wheels. Inside, suspicion began to settle like frost. The train held 12 first-class passengers. Among them were a young couple returning from their honeymoon, an elderly governess bound for Paris, a military officer on leave, the professor, a widowed countess, and several businessmen of varying disposition. Each had retired at different hours. Each claimed to have heard nothing unusual before the scream, but the facts remained immovable. The door had been locked from within, the window sealed, no weapon present. A single fatal wound delivered with clinical precision, and the line of salt, like a cryptic signature. The storm showed no sign of abating. The engine lay silent. The Snowbound Express had become a prison. Somewhere among them was a killer, and the crime at first glance appeared utterly unsolvable. The murmur in the dining car had begun to fray into accusation when a small, impeccably dressed gentleman who had thus far remained quietly seated near the samovar rose to his feet. He had been travelling alone, having boarded in London without fanfare. His luggage was modest, his manner discreet. Yet there was about him an air of order so precise that even in the flickering lamplight his moustache seemed sculpted to symmetry. "I beg your pardon," he said gently, his accent foreign but refined. "It is perhaps premature to surrender ourselves to panic. May I suggest that we return to the compartment and observe with calm?" The conductor blinked at him. "And you are, sir, a fellow passenger only, but one who has, how shall I say, an interest in problems of logic." There was something in his tone, mild but firm, that quieted the room. The professor nodded faintly, recognizing in the stranger's composure a disciplined mind. Reluctantly, the conductor agreed. They returned to compartment 7. The body had not been moved. The doctor stood aside as the little gentleman approached, careful not to disturb the salt on the carpet. He did not step over it at once. Instead, he crouched slightly in the doorway, studying the thin white trail. "Curious," he murmured. "It is nothing but salt," the professor repeated. "A theatrical touch, perhaps." "Ah, but theatre requires an audience," the gentleman replied softly. "Who was meant to see it?" He removed a folded handkerchief and delicately touched the salt nearest the threshold. It was dry, perfectly dry, despite the damp that clung faintly to boots and hems from the snow outside. "Tell me," he asked the conductor, when the door was forced, "was there resistance beyond the bolt?" "No, sir, only the bolt. We broke it clean. And no sign of tampering with the lock. None." The gentleman stepped carefully inside, placing his polished shoes between the grains of salt rather than upon them. His eyes moved slowly, deliberately over the berth, the writing desk, the mirror. He paused at the wash basin. "You mentioned it was dripping." "Yes, sir," said the conductor, "but it was turned off." The gentleman bent closer. A faint bead of water clung to the rim of the basin, trembling before falling. He touched the metal tap with his fingertips and withdrew them at once. "Cold," he observed. "Very cold." "Well, the carriage is hardly warm." "No," the gentleman agreed. But the water in the tank above would not freeze so swiftly. "It was used recently." The doctor frowned. "The victim may have washed his hands, perhaps." The gentleman's gaze shifted to the victim's fingers. They were stiff, slightly curled, and beneath the nails, faint traces of white. "Salt," the professor said quickly, "or something that resembles it." The gentleman rose and examined the mirror more closely. The smear upon its surface was not random. It bore the faint outline of 2 fingers drawn downward, as though someone had steadied themselves. "Who discovered the body first?" he asked. The conductor hesitated. "The lady in compartment 8. She claimed she heard a thud and came out to investigate. The door was closed. She tried the handle, found it locked, and raised the alarm. And before that, no one saw the victim retire." The military officer spoke up. "I passed him in the corridor around 11. He seemed agitated, kept looking over his shoulder." "Did he speak?" "Only to complain about the draft." The gentleman nodded, absorbing this without comment. He moved now to the writing desk. The key lay precisely where it had been described. Too precisely. It sat square to the desk's edge, aligned with almost unnatural neatness. He turned to the conductor. "When you forced the door, was the desk disturbed?" "No, sir, not even slightly." The conductor thought. "Number?" "It was as you see it." The gentleman's eyes narrowed faintly. "Forgive me," he said, "but a man stabbed through the heart rarely arranges his key so neatly before expiring." Silence settled over the compartment. He crouched once more by the salt trail. Its line was straight, deliberate, and stopped exactly at the victim's hands, though placed there to indicate something, or to conceal something. "Notice," he said quietly, "that the salt lies only upon the carpet's surface. It has not been ground in by footfall. Therefore, it was placed after the final movement in this room." "Meaning?" the professor asked. "Meaning that when the salt was scattered, the victim was already still." A chill moved through those present. If the door was locked from within, the doctor said slowly, then the murderer must still be on this train. The gentleman inclined his head. That, I fear, is obvious. But the manner in which our culprit departed this compartment that is less so. He straightened, smoothing his cuffs with absent precision. There is one further question, he added softly. Why salt? No one answered. Outside, the wind battered the carriage walls, and snow pressed against the windows in thickening layers. The train remained immobile, sealed within the storm. Inside compartment 7, amid the stillness of the dead man and the deliberate white line across the floor, the first fragile cracks in certainty had begun to show. And though the passengers did not yet realize it, someone among them had already betrayed more than they intended. The little gentleman requested that the body remain undisturbed and that each passenger return, one by one, to the dining car. There, beneath the steady hiss of the samovar and the dim glow of shaded lamps, he would ask a few simple questions. Nothing more, nothing alarming. The storm raged on outside, but inside the dining car, the air felt tight, compressed by unspoken fears. The young honeymooners were called first. They entered together, hands clasped as though separation might condemn them. "You retired early?" the gentleman asked mildly. "Yes," said the husband quickly. "Around 10:30. We were tired from the crossing." "And you heard nothing?" The wife hesitated.
"Only perhaps footsteps in the corridor."
"But that is not unusual." "At what hour?" "Two cannot say exactly. Perhaps near midnight." Her husband gave her hand a small warning squeeze. The gentleman's eyes flickered briefly to the gesture. "And you did not open your door?" "No," the husband replied firmly. "We saw no reason." The gentleman inclined his head and dismissed them gently. Next came the elderly governess. Her back was rigid with indignation. "I heard the scream, of course," she declared, "but before that, nothing. I had been reading until 11:30. Did you pass compartment 7 earlier in the evening?" "Yes, the gentleman was inside. I heard him moving about, as though pacing. The military officer followed. His account was crisp, disciplined. I walked the corridor at 11:15. Needed air. The victim nearly collided with me outside his door." "You are certain of the time?" "I checked my watch upon returning to my compartment." "And after?" "I slept until the commotion." "You carry a knife?" the gentleman asked suddenly. The officer stiffened. "A service penknife, yes. In my luggage. May I see it later?" "If you wish." The professor entered next, adjusting his spectacles nervously. "You examined the salt with great confidence," the gentleman observed. "It is common sodium chloride, nothing exotic. Yet you did not taste it." The professor blinked. "Taste it, to confirm." That would have been absurd, would it? The flush crept into the professor's cheeks. "I assure you, sir, I know salt by sight." "I do not doubt your knowledge," the gentleman replied softly. "Only your haste." Then came the widowed countess, veiled and composed. "I did not know the deceased," she said coolly. "I keep to myself. You did not dine in the same car. Number. And yet the steward recalls you glancing toward his table more than once. A faint tightening at the corner of her mouth. Idle observation, nothing more. You retired at what time?" "Before 11. "And remained inside?" "Yes." The gentleman paused. "Forgive me, madam, but the hem of your gown is damp." Her gloved fingers tightened on her reticule. "The corridor is narrow. One brushes against melting snow from others' boots." "Indeed." At last, the lady from compartment 8, the one who had raised the alarm, was shown in. She appeared pale but resolute. "You heard a thud?" the gentleman prompted. "Yes, a heavy sound. I thought someone had fallen." "At what hour?" "Just before midnight." "You tried the handle immediately?" "Yes, it was locked." "Did you kneel, peer beneath the door?" She frowned faintly. "Number. I simply called for help." "You did not notice anything unusual on the floor?" "Nothing." The gentleman's gaze held hers a fraction longer than courtesy required. Then he smiled gently and dismissed her. When she had gone, he remained seated, fingertips pressed together. The accounts overlapped but imperfectly. Footsteps near midnight, a thud, a man pacing, a damp hem, a professor too certain, a husband too quick to answer for his wife, a countess who watched more than she admitted, and always the locked door. the key placed with unnatural neatness, the salt dry and undisturbed. He rose at last and returned alone to compartment 7. The corridor was empty now, the passengers confined to uneasy waiting. He stood once more at the threshold, studying the line of white grains. The lady from compartment 8 had claimed she saw nothing unusual on the floor, yet the salt lay directly before the door. Impossible not to see, unless his eyes shifted to the bottom edge of the door itself. There, along the wood, ran the faintest abrasion, fresh, pale against darker varnish, as though something thin had passed beneath it, something that might disturb nothing, yet change everything. Behind him the train groaned as the wind struck it broadside. Within the snowbound prison the voices had spoken, but not one had spoken entirely true. And now, at last, the deception had begun to take shape. The little gentleman returned to the observation car, his mind turning over the fragments of conversations and glimpses he had gathered from each passenger. Alone, he allowed himself to trace the web of motives that bound them together, considering not just what they had done, but why they might have done it. Each person was a puzzle, and the pieces seemed at first incompatible, a line that could not connect, a shadow that refused to fall in place. Yet even chaos can yield to careful reasoning. The Countess, elegantly poised but with a tremor in her voice, had been unusually attentive to the deceased, asking questions that went beyond mere courtesy. Jealousy, perhaps, or a need to secure her social standing in the delicate balance of aristocratic connections. Then there was the young merchant, eager to impress yet visibly anxious. Whenever his own alibi was probed, his financial troubles could have made him vulnerable to manipulation or driven him to rash action. The military officer, a man of discipline and routine, had been irritated by delays, snapping at minor inconveniences. Yet he seemed to linger near the crime scene under the pretense of curiosity. Was it duty, or was there something more personal at stake? The professor, scholarly and precise, had spoken of intellectual rivalry in tones that sometimes hinted at hidden resentment, a simmering envy that could turn deadly under provocation. Even the young wife, demure and careful in her speech, had a quickness in her reactions, the way she shifted her eyes or adjusted her seating, suggesting she was weighing what to reveal and what to conceal with meticulous care. The little gentleman crouched by a low table, arranging a small notebook and pencil, mapping connections, observing the subtle overlaps. The Countess had met the merchant months before at a gallery exhibition. The professor had once criticized the officer's expertise in some technical matter that went unmentioned in polite company. The young wife had family ties to both the merchant and the Countess, connections that suggested not just friendship, but stakes of inheritance, social influence, and reputation. Greed, revenge, jealousy, and fear all swirled together, creating a tangle that was not easily undone. He considered the timing of each passenger's movements, who had been near the compartments when the first crime occurred, who had the opportunity to manipulate objects unseen, and yet the professor's meticulous notes, combined with the subtle reactions of the others, suggested that opportunity alone could not explain the pattern. Motive had to align with knowledge and means, each reinforcing the other. The little gentleman tapped his chin thoughtfully. It was not enough to know that one individual resented another or that someone had financial pressure. These alone did not account for the precision of the crime-locked door, the misaligned key, the careful placement of the salt. Someone had to be calculating, someone had to anticipate reactions, and someone had to exploit the weaknesses of those around them. He moved among the passengers subtly, observing glances, listening for contradictions, weighing the truth behind the carefully phrased sentences. A comment about a past encounter here, a hesitation there, small as a breath yet telling as a shout. Each detail, when placed in relation to the others, began to form an invisible lattice. He traced it carefully, knowing that once one strand of deception was confirmed, the others would align in turn. And yet, even as the patterns began to emerge, the little gentleman understood that no single theory explained everything. Each passenger had a reason, each had a connection, each had a fear, a desire, a hidden grievance. To unravel the mystery, he would have to find the thread that linked them all, the subtle intersection where motive, opportunity, and psychological compulsion converged. Until that point, the truth remained a maze, with many false turns and dead ends, each more convincing than the last. He allowed himself a faint contemplative smile, knowing that patience, observation, and the quiet pressure of questions carefully posed would eventually illuminate the central thread. The web of motives was complex, but not beyond comprehension. And in that realization, he found the confidence to continue, to probe, to watch, and to guide the investigation closer to the heart of deception. The morning sun struggled to pierce the dense veil of snow, casting a pale gray light over the frozen tracks. Inside the train, the passengers had been corralled once more into the dining car, their anxiety fraying into impatience. The conductor and the doctor had spent hours recounting events, examining the salt trail, the locked door, and the strange abrasions beneath it. At last, they appeared to have discovered what seemed to be a decisive lead. A small steel letter opener had been found wedged between the mattress and the bed frame in compartment 7, its blade smeared faintly with the victim's blood. The authorities, previously restrained in their assessment, seized upon it eagerly. A simple, solitary weapon, the doctor announced, holding it with gloved hands. One stab, one fatal blow. Mystery solved. The conductor nodded gravely, already imagining the announcement to the railway company and the press. Whispers of relief rippled through the assembled passengers, the tension eased, however slightly. Yet the little gentleman remained seated, calm, his gaze drifting over the scene with meticulous patience. He allowed the others their triumph, but made no comment. He did not rush to hold the letter opener, nor did he question the doctor's reasoning immediately. Instead, he crouched near the salt trail once more, brushing a fingertip delicately along the grains. The line remained untouched, pristine, stopping at the victim's hand with the precision of a message or a warning. He studied the letter opener in silence. Its blade was indeed sharp, its edge capable of delivering the wound. Yet something about it disturbed him, the angle of the bloodstain, the way the handle showed only the faintest fingerprints. If this were the instrument used by the killer, then how had it been hidden so effortlessly? And more importantly, how had the victim's hand come to rest exactly atop the salt trail without disturbing it? He turned to the assembled passengers, noting their expressions. Relief, curiosity, lingering fear, and a certain eagerness to be cleared from suspicion. But one passenger, the widowed countess, watched quietly from the corner, her eyes narrowed, lips pressed thin. Another, the military officer, shifted his weight nervously, the penknife still conspicuous in his pocket. The honeymooners clung to each other, repeating their account in quiet tones, almost rehearsing. Even the professor, who had been so confident in identifying the salt, now fiddled with his spectacles, as though attempting to realign reality itself to match his explanation. The letter opener, the gentleman murmured to himself, may be evidence, but is it proof? The conductor, sensing victory, interjected eagerly. Sir, surely you agree. The weapon is here. The wound corresponds. What more could we need? The little gentleman smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, but his eyes remained alert. Ah, but one must ask, who placed it there, and when? He allowed the words to hang. No one answered. The questions were uncomfortable, insinuating, yet necessary. He returned to the subtle details that had so far escaped attention. The alignment of the key on the desk, the smear on the mirror, the barely perceptible abrasion at the base of the door. Each one was a whisper, a hint that the solution was not as simple as it appeared. The letter opener, though convenient, accounted for only one aspect of the crime. The locked door, the salt, the precise positioning of objects all pointed to a deeper cunning, one that a single piece of steel could not reveal. The authorities, satisfied with the apparent breakthrough, began their procedural formalities, questioning passengers in a perfunctory manner, logging the weapon, and drafting statements. The little gentleman remained apart, observing, analyzing, calculating. He could see the threads beginning to weave into a web of misdirection, a story told to satisfy expectation rather than truth. And in the compartment beyond, the real criminal watched silently, cloaked in the pretense of relief. They had allowed the authorities a small triumph, a false victory to appease curiosity, while they remained poised to act again, invisible but present. Outside, the snow pressed ever tighter against the train. Inside, the detective felt the pulse of danger, the quiet certainty that the case was far from over, and that the shadow of the true culprit lingered just beyond reach, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The little gentleman returned once more to compartment 7, moving with a quiet deliberation that contrasted sharply with the flurry of activity in the dining car. The letter opener had been bagged, examined, and catalogued, and yet it offered him nothing beyond what he had already suspected. A convenient distraction, a neat red herring. His eyes, calm but searching, returned to the mirror above the writing desk, lingering on the faint smear still visible at its corner. It was a small detail, almost imperceptible, but it seemed familiar. A memory stirred a case from years past, long since forgotten but etched sharply in his mind, a case of misdirection, deception, and subtle manipulation. He crouched, examining the faint scratch along the base of the door once again. The abrasion was shallow, consistent with a thin tool or object used in a deliberate motion, an old technique he had seen once before. A lock could be compromised without leaving obvious signs, allowing a carefully planned crime to appear impossible. But why? And to what end? As his gaze swept the compartment, it fell upon a seemingly trivial object, a small embossed card, tucked between the corner of the writing desk and the wall. He picked it up and examined it under the dim lamplight. It bore the seal of a prominent London auction house. A name printed in delicate script caught his attention. The art dealer's name from years ago, long before this journey. That case had involved a series of missing artworks, stolen under circumstances that had puzzled the authorities, only to vanish from the record once the trail went cold. A chill passed over him. He recalled the connections now. The art dealer, the professor with his precise knowledge of chemicals, the countess with ties to wealthy collectors, the military officer with an interest in rare objects, even the young couple who had travelled to London frequently. Each had moved in circles that overlapped with that old investigation. Greed, ambition, and old rivalries had festered quietly, unnoticed until now. The Snowbound Express was more than a simple journey. It was a convergence of past grievances and secret dealings, a microcosm of ambition and envy, brought together by circumstance. He rose, moving into the corridor. The other passengers were still assembled in the dining car, murmuring, casting anxious glances toward the compartment. They had been careful to maintain appearances, each reciting their alibis with confidence, each hiding the shadow of a prior connection. The detective's mind traced the invisible lines linking them. The Countess had bid unsuccessfully against the deceased. In an auction years ago, the professor had once consulted on an appraisal disputed by the victim. The military officer had been involved in recovering stolen artifacts, some of which had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The young couple had attended a private showing where the art dealer had caused a scandal by accusing an acquaintance of forgery. Each of these threads was subtle, nearly imperceptible in isolation, yet together they formed a web of shared history, grievances, and opportunity. The crime, he realized, was not merely about the events of the night, it was the culmination of years of intersecting ambition and resentment. The salt, the locked door, the precise placement of objects, they were all echoes of past cunning, applied now with ruthless precision. He returned to the dining car, careful to watch the reactions of those assembled. Small tells betrayed them. The Countess's hand trembled slightly as she smoothed her gown. The professor adjusted his spectacles nervously. Eyes darting the military officer's jaw tightened. Even the young husband's reassurances to his wife seemed a shade too forceful, as though trying to suppress a memory of past tension. The detective allowed these observations to settle in his mind, weaving them together with the physical clues: the salt, the mirror smear, the abrasion at the door. The crime was no longer merely about a single act of violence. It was the resurfacing of old rivalries, long-buried resentments, and ambitions that had waited patiently for the right moment to erupt. Outside, the snow pressed against the train like a frozen tide, isolating them from the world beyond. Inside, the passengers remained tense, each unaware that the invisible threads of their shared past were now laid bare in the keen eye of one observant mind. The shadows of history had crept forward into the present, and the detective knew that understanding them was the only way to reveal the truth hidden within the snowbound carriages. The little gentleman returned to compartment 7 once more, this time carrying only a small leather notebook and a pencil. He did not disturb the body, nor the salt trail, nor the mirror smear. Instead, he positioned himself near the doorway, as if preparing for a quiet experiment. His eyes, sharp yet gentle, scanned every inch of the compartment, as though reading a language written in the smallest details of human behavior. He called the passengers back into the dining car, not to question them directly, but to observe their reactions to an unusual prompt. He began by asking each passenger to recount, in as much detail as they could, what they remembered about the victim's behavior in the weeks leading up to the journey. At first, the exercise seemed innocuous, a simple memory test. Most answered without hesitation, describing dinners, conversations, or minor disagreements. But then he introduced a subtle twist. "Imagine," he said softly, "that the victim had left you a personal note to be discovered only after his passing. What might it say to each of you?" He paused deliberately, letting the question settle like a weight in the room. Eyes flicked nervously. The Countess's gloved fingers tightened on the edge of the table. The professor cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles with a sudden rigidity. The military officer's jaw stiffened, and the young husband's reassurances to his wife faltered. Even the elderly governess, who had seemed most composed, hesitated before answering. The gentleman made no comment, instead jotting notes in his leather-bound notebook with small, precise strokes. He had learned long ago that people reveal more in the manner of evasion than in the content of their speech. Hesitation over clarity, the tiny tremor of the hand, these were far more telling than words alone. When he reached the professor, the effect was immediate. "To think he would have commended my knowledge," the man stammered, voice higher than usual. "Perhaps congratulated me on recognizing the salt." His eyes flicked toward the compartment door involuntarily, as though seeking confirmation. The detective's gaze remained serene. "Indeed," he said quietly. "And if the note contained a warning, perhaps regarding another's intentions?" The professor faltered, swallowing. "I cannot say." He fidgeted with the edge of his coat, the skin of his knuckles paling. The subtle crack in his composure, the rapid, shallow blink, was enough for the detective to note. Something in the man's memory or fear of it was more vivid than it should have been. He moved on to the Countess, framing his question in the same delicate way. A warning, perhaps, of old rivalries or the return of long-forgotten affairs. Her eyes narrowed sharply. She drew herself up, voice clipped, controlled. "I have no recollection of such matters. They are—" But the detective had already seen the slight twitch at her mouth, the subtle glance toward the door of compartment 7. Even her denial betrayed a small anxiety she could not entirely suppress. By the time the military officer was asked, the detective had already discerned a pattern. Every passenger whose past intersected with the deceased's life displayed a subtle reaction and hesitation. A micro-expression, a physiological tell that belied their words. The unusual tactic had not extracted confessions, nor direct admissions, maintained, but it had highlighted fissures in the carefully constructed facades each passenger maintained. The detective returned to the compartment alone, crouching beside the salt trail and the faint smear on the mirror. He had observed the psychological responses, and now he could align them with the physical evidence. The salt, the key, the mirror, the abrasion beneath the door, they were all part of a tableau. But one element had shifted in light of his unconventional test. The professor's sudden unease suggested he had more than academic interest in the arrangement of objects and powders. The detective's mind traced the possibilities, noting how fear, guilt, or anticipation of exposure could drive small actions, placing salt in a precise line, aligning the key, ensuring the door seemed locked from within. Each subtle act now took on a new significance, revealing not mere theatricality, but the deliberate manipulation of perception. Outside, the storm continued to batter the train. Inside, the passengers waited, unaware that the detective had already begun to see the outlines of deception emerge from their composed exteriors. The unconventional clue, a psychological test of memory, anticipation, and fear, had illuminated the first true fracture in the web of lies. And with it, the shadow of the real criminal drew a little closer to revelation. The little gentleman had barely begun to organize his observations when a sudden commotion erupted in the corridor outside compartment 7. Voices, raised in alarm, carried through the narrow passage like a sharp gust. The conductor appeared first, his face pale, followed by the military officer and the young husband, all gesturing toward the compartment. He moved swiftly, his polished shoes silent on the carpeted floor, and reached the doorway just as the conductor fumbled with the compartment key. The lock had been forced again, but the scene inside was no longer the same. The letter opener, bagged and labeled only moments before as the supposed key to the mystery, was gone. The bag, tucked under the seat for safekeeping, had vanished. The small scatter of salt remained untouched, but the careful alignment of the key on the desk had been disturbed, now lying askew. Even the faint smear on the mirror bore evidence of tampering. Someone had wiped at it lightly, leaving only a ghost of what had been. A ripple of panic passed through the assembled passengers. "Impossible!" the conductor exclaimed. "It was secure just this morning." The little gentleman crouched, eyes sharp, observing every movement. Nothing had been stolen from the other compartments, and yet here, in the very heart of the crime scene, a critical piece of evidence had disappeared. Whoever had taken it knew its importance and had acted with stealth and precision. He stood slowly, adjusting his cuffs, his calm demeanor masking a growing urgency. The young husband and wife looked on in disbelief. Who would do such a thing?" the husband stammered. "Someone very careful," the detective replied quietly. His eyes swept the compartment again, noting subtle details: the disturbance of the desk, the faint scuff marks on the floor near the doorway, a tiny thread caught on the edge of the lock. Each indicated that the thief had been deliberate, measured, and aware that the detective was watching. He turned to the assembled passengers in the corridor. "One of you has moved while I was occupied," he said softly. The words were calm, almost conversational, yet they carried weight. The Countess stiffened imperceptibly, the professor adjusted his spectacles too deliberately, the military officer shifted his stance. Each action, minor in isolation, now seemed suspect in light of the vanished evidence. The detective's mind raced. The stolen letter opener had been the only tangible link to the wound. Without it, the authorities would be forced to rely on circumstantial observations, the salt, the smear, the locked doorknob of which could, on their own, definitively identify the perpetrator. Whoever had taken it intended to muddle the case, to create confusion, to buy time. Outside, the wind rattled the carriage windows, a reminder that they remained trapped, miles from any outside authority. Inside, trust had fractured. Every passenger was now a potential suspect, every gesture, word, or glance weighed against the others. The detective knew that the criminal's confidence was growing. Someone had gambled that the disappearance would delay the investigation long enough to cover further actions. He bent to inspect the salt again. It remained pristine, unbroken. That detail alone told him the thief had been careful not to disturb the trail, preserving the illusion that nothing had changed. It was a display of calculated misdirection, a psychological maneuver as precise as any physical act of the crime. The detective straightened, gaze sweeping the passengers once more. The vanished evidence had raised the stakes, turning a complex puzzle into a perilous game. Every remaining clue, every reaction, every hidden motive now mattered more than ever. Outside, the snowbound landscape pressed in, isolating them all. Inside, the predator was confident, invisible, and still watching. He understood with sudden clarity. The theft was not just an attempt to hinder the investigation, it was a warning. The game had shifted. And the little gentleman knew that, unless he acted carefully, the truth might vanish entirely along with the missing evidence. The tension in the dining car had barely begun to settle when a sudden metallic clang echoed through the corridor, followed by a muffled cry. Passengers jumped from their seats, eyes wide, as the little gentleman rose slowly, his composure unbroken, though his senses sharpened instantly. The sound had come from the rear of the train, near the sleeping car where several passengers had been confined. He moved swiftly, stepping lightly over the carpet, the others trailing in anxious silence. When he reached the scene, the compartment door to number 11 was ajar. A chill ran through him before he even looked inside. The occupant, young merchant traveling to Paris, was slumped on the floor, a trickle of blood staining his coat. But it was not the fatal wound that alarmed the detective most. The merchant's eyes were wide with terror, and clutched in his hand was a scrap of paper, torn and smeared. He had clearly attempted to signal something, but the message was incomplete. The passengers gathered behind him, murmuring in disbelief. "Another attack," whispered the young wife, clutching her husband's arm. "How can this be happening?" The little gentleman knelt beside the merchant, assessing the injury. It was enough to frighten, to send a message, but not enough to kill. Still, the implications were grave. Whoever had committed the first murder was not finished. Whoever had stolen the letter opener had planned this escalation, showing that the predator was watching, adapting, and several steps ahead. He took the torn paper carefully, examining the fragment of writing. It contained only a few words, partially legible. "Watch closely. Next." His mind raced. This was no random act. It was a deliberate warning, a psychological maneuver to unsettle the passengers, to disrupt the investigation, and perhaps to expose the detective himself to danger. Turning to the others, he spoke quietly but firmly. "The individual responsible knows we are pursuing the truth. They are prepared to act again. That is why the evidence was removed, why the first murder was so precise, and now why this attempt has been made. We are dealing with a mind that thrives on control and fear." The merchant, pale and shaking, looked up at him. "Two don't know why they targeted me," he stammered. "I have no connection to the other passenger." The detective considered this carefully. That was precisely what a clever perpetrator would exploit: the scattering of apparent targets, the illusion of randomness, to mask a more subtle pattern. He noted the merchant's eyes, which darted to the Countess and the professor across the room. A fleeting reaction, barely perceptible, but it suggested recognition, or at least suspicion. Outside, the storm continued to batter the train, each gust making the carriages tremble. Inside, the sense of confinement grew heavier. No one could leave. No help could arrive. The predator could strike again at any moment, and each step he took was a step toward another victim. He returned to compartment 7, crouching near the salt trail, which remained untouched, yet now seemed a silent witness to escalating peril. The smear on the mirror, the misaligned key, the vanished letter opener all combined with the new attack to form a pattern. The criminal was watching carefully, manipulating the scene, and daring him to follow. The little gentleman's mind worked swiftly, piecing together the movements, the reactions, and the subtle hints revealed by the passengers' responses. The first crime had been a display of control, the theft of evidence a challenge, and the attempted second attack a test of his resolve and probing for weakness. He rose slowly, eyes narrowing. Whoever had orchestrated these events was clever, patient, and ruthless. The game was no longer about solving a past murder, it was about preventing another. The predator was still several moves ahead, and the detective understood that the next hour could prove decisive. Every observation, every detail, every unspoken hesitation among the passengers now held potential life-or-death significance. The train groaned under the snow, a frozen labyrinth with danger lurking at every turn. Inside, the little gentleman's mind was already racing, anticipating the next move, ready to counteract the unseen hand that had so far stayed just out of reach. The stakes had risen, and the margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. The little gentleman returned to the dining car, moving with the quiet deliberation of a man whose mind was already several steps ahead of everyone else. The passengers were still shaken by the merchant's narrow escape, whispering anxiously among themselves, glancing at each other as though suspecting the shadow of guilt in every gesture. The detective observed them silently, his gaze sweeping each face, each nervous twitch, each subtle reaction, storing every detail. He began retracing the sequence of events in his mind. The first murder, the trail of salt, the locked door, the carefully placed key, the mirror smear had been deliberate, theatrical even. Then the theft of the letter opener had disrupted what the authorities had hoped would be a solved case. And now, the attempted second attack revealed that the perpetrator was calculating, ruthless, and several moves ahead. And yet, as he moved among the passengers, a tiny detail returned to his mind, something that had seemed trivial at first, almost laughably so. It was a single, casual comment made by the Countess early in the evening. She had remarked, almost in passing, on the peculiar taste of the salt on her hors d'oeuvres in the dining car, dismissing it as too coarse for ordinary use. At the time, it had seemed inconsequential, a remark of idle observation. But now, confronted with the precise line of salt in compartment 7, the comment resonated with a new clarity. He crouched near the small pile still lying undisturbed, and the pieces began to align. The salt had been chosen intentionally, not for its symbolism, but for its distinctive quality, a signature, a mark known only to someone familiar with the finer distinctions between ordinary kitchen salt and certain refined varieties favored in London households and elite kitchens. It was a calling card disguised as misdirection. The detective's mind raced further. The professor had claimed to recognize the salt immediately, with confidence bordering on certainty. That assertion now took on a different hue. Knowledge that had seemed purely academic suddenly became suspicious. The salt had been both a clue and a test laid to provoke recognition in someone who might have prior familiarity, and to obscure the true method of the crime from others. Then there was the mirror smear, so slight that the authorities had overlooked it. The gesture implied that the perpetrator had steadied themselves, perhaps to check the alignment of the objects in the compartment, or to measure the space precisely for some subtle maneuver. And the small abrasion along the bottom of the door is easy to miss, yet perfectly positioned showed where a thin object, like the letter opener or another tool, had been inserted to manipulate the bolt or test for weakness. Everything had been in plain sight. The carefully placed salt, the key's alignment, the mirror smear, the abrasional of these were elements of the same pattern, orchestrated to conceal the simplicity of the perpetrator's movements, while challenging anyone who tried to follow the logic. Each action had meaning, each detail a purpose, and together they formed a signature that was as audacious as it was precise. The little gentleman's eyes shifted to the passengers. He could see it now. The subtle reactions, the micro-expressions, the small tells that had seemed insignificant until viewed through the lens of the emerging pattern. The Countess, the Professor, even the military officer, they had each moved, spoken or hesitated, in ways that now revealed their familiarity with both the victim and the tools of the crime. He rose slowly, folding his notebook under one arm. The pattern had emerged not through brute force, nor through the overt evidence, but through observation, patience, and a careful reading of human behavior. The answer had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting for a mind disciplined enough to notice the invisible threads linking motive, method, and opportunity. Outside, the snow pressed harder against the train, blanketing the world in white. Inside, the detective understood that he had reached the point where observation became revelation, and that the final unraveling of the mystery was now within reach. The perpetrator had left a trail of a pattern woven so subtly that only a discerning mind could see it. And now, at last, he could. The little gentleman returned once more to compartment 7, his steps measured, eyes tracing the frozen landscape through the frosted window even as his mind replayed the sequence of events in precise order. He could feel the tension in the carriage, thick enough to touch passengers shifting nervously, whispers ricocheting off the walls, each movement betraying a fraction of their inner unease. He allowed them to stew for a moment. Patience was a tool as sharp as any knife. He began with a quiet question, directed not at all the passengers, but at the room itself. Why was the salt used? His voice was soft, almost casual, yet every ear turned toward him. The pause lingered, drawing attention to the subtle, deliberate misplacement of grains across the carpet. The line was precise, sterile almost in its perfection. It was a message, yes, but to whom and why? He returned to the subtle clues he had been tracking. The mirror smear, the displaced key, the thin abrasion at the bottom of the door. All signs pointed to the same individual, but they only hinted at motive. Greed, rivalry, revengeathos were easy to imagine. Yet, as he pieced together the psychological puzzle, a darker, more intimate motive emerged. The professor, whom everyone had dismissed as merely scholarly, shifted uneasily in his chair. It was the slight tremor in his hands, combined with the recognition of the unique salt, that had first drawn the detective's attention. But now, with the pattern clear, the gentleman understood that the professor had been seeking more than concealment of a theft or a crime of opportunity. He had been attempting to erase a personal humiliation, one that had haunted him for years, festering in secret until it had metastasized into obsession. The little gentleman's eyes swept the room, fixing on the professor. "You were present at the auction in London, were you not?" he said gently. "The one where a dispute over authenticity nearly ruined a man's reputation, your reputation." The professor swallowed, stiffening. "Two do not see the relevance," he said, voice tight, controlled. yet the tightening of his lips betrayed him. "It is highly relevant," the detective continued, calm, precise. "The art dealer you observed, the man now deceased, accused you publicly of forgery or misjudgment, yes?" The professor's hand twitched toward his spectacles, as though adjusting them would restore some composure. "It was a misunderstanding," he insisted. "Two never intended harm. It was merely professional rivalry." "Professional rivalry," the detective echoed softly, "that has festered into personal vengeance. Years of perceived injustice, humiliation, and the quiet gnawing fear that your life, reputation, and career were irreparably tainted. You could not forgive the man, and you could not allow him to prevail. So you planned, carefully, deliberately, to exact a punishment he could not anticipate." The professor's eyes widened, betraying a flicker of fear, of recognition. The line of salt, the locked door, the meticulous placement of the key, each act was symbolic, ritualistic even, a statement of control and superiority. The first murder had been carefully orchestrated not just to eliminate a rival, but to demonstrate mastery, to prove to himself that he could manipulate life and death with precision. "And the second attempt?" the detective asked softly. "A warning to others, or a demonstration of your continuing power?" The professor's jaw tightened. "Two did not intend harm," he muttered. "Only control. Only to show them that nothing passes unnoticed." The little gentleman nodded, noting the confession, the subtle unveiling of the mind behind the crime. The motive was no longer conventional. It was the culmination of years of obsession, a relentless drive to assert intellectual dominance and to expunge the lingering sting of disgrace. Greed, revenge, and envy had been mere vehicles for a more profound psychological imperativia, compulsion to control, to rewrite the past, and to assert superiority through terror and manipulation. Outside, the snow pressed heavily against the train, a frozen mirror of the cold precision within the carriage. Inside, the passengers remained tense, uncertain, but now the true nature of the threat had been revealed. The crime had been committed not merely for gain, not merely for revenge, but for something far darker, the need to dominate, to impose one's will with absolute authority. And the little gentleman understood, with the clarity of one who had unraveled the human mind, that the shadow of obsession was more dangerous than any mere weapon, more deadly than any ordinary scheme. The little gentleman gathered the passengers once more, guiding them back to compartment 7, where the room itself had become a stage. The salt line lay undisturbed, the mirror smear still faintly visible, and the key rested in its precise alignment once more, carefully replaced. Outside, the wind screamed against the windows, rattling the train with relentless fury, as if the storm itself were eager to witness the culmination of events. He addressed the group, his voice calm, deliberate, carrying the weight of certainty. "We have examined the patterns, observed reactions, and noted subtleties that might have seemed trivial to others. It is now time to confront the truth." He allowed a pause, letting the words settle over the passengers like a slow frost. All eyes turned to the professor, whose face betrayed the faintest tremor of unease. He straightened, attempting to hide it behind a composed veneer, but the detective had long since learned that no facade could withstand the pressure of carefully applied observation. "Professor," he said softly, stepping closer, "you were present at the auction where the deceased accused you unjustly of forgery, a slight that has haunted you for years. The theft of his reputation, the humiliation, the quiet gnawing sense of being wronged, these have driven you to extremes." The professor's hand clenched the edge of his seat.
I did what any man might have done."
"I only sought to protect myself." His voice rose, cracking under the strain, betraying the carefully cultivated restraint that had guided him thus far. The little gentleman's gaze remained unwavering. "To protect yourself, you removed him from the world entirely. To assert dominance, you orchestrated the salt, the locked door, the misplaced key. Each act was symbolic, demonstrating your control. Even the stolen letter opener was part of your game, designed to distract, mislead, and delay discovery." A bead of sweat formed on the professor's brow. It was only to prove that I could." His voice trailed, uncertain, a confession beginning to take shape beneath the pressure. "You were willing to manipulate, to frighten, to attempt harm a second time, because the compulsion to dominate was stronger than conscience. The attempt on the merchant tonight was not random, it was a continuation of your pattern, a test to see if your control could remain absolute. The professor shifted uneasily, glancing toward the door, then back to the detective. His breathing was shallow, rapid. You cannot prove anything," he hissed, the final veil of defiance struggling to hold. The little gentleman stepped closer still, maintaining his calm, measured composure. "You need not prove anything to me. I have observed your methods, your reactions, your inconsistencies. You see, the pattern was always in plain sight. The salt, the key, the mirror smear, the abrasion tools of the mind as much as of action. And your reactions, subtle though they were, have told me more than any weapon ever could." A long silence fell over the compartment. The passengers leaned forward, breaths held, as if the revelation itself might shatter the fragile calm. Finally the professor slumped, shoulders sagging, the defiance draining from his posture. Yes, it was me," he admitted in a low, trembling voice. "I could not endure the shame, the humiliation. I only wanted to restore what had been taken from me, to assert my superiority." The little gentleman nodded gently, not with triumph, but with a quiet finality. "And now the consequences are unavoidable. You acted with calculation and courage only in your mind, but reality has caught up." The conductor and the doctor stepped forward, taking the professor into custody, their hands steady despite the lingering tension. The other passengers exhaled in relief, though the chill of the snow outside seemed to linger in their bones. The detective returned to the small details of the compartment, the salt line, the faint smear, the key. He had orchestrated no dramatic trap, had allowed no overt spectacle, yet the culmination of observation, patience, and understanding of human nature had achieved its end. Outside, the storm began to relent, snow falling more softly against the train, as if acknowledging that the trial of minds within had reached its conclusion. Inside, the little gentleman allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction, knowing that the pattern had been revealed, the motive exposed, and the criminal unmasked not by force, but by the keen perception of truth carefully drawn from the shadows. The little gentleman allowed the conductor and the doctor to escort the professor down the corridor, the man now silent and subdued, weighed down by the inevitability of exposure. The other passengers began to relax, whisper in relief, exchanging tentative smiles. And even the young honeymooners unclasped their hands, as though the tension of the past hours had lifted. For a brief moment, it seemed the case was concluded, the predator revealed, and the nightmare of the Snowbound Express near its end. Yet the detective remained seated in compartment 7, eyes drifting over the salt trail and the key's neat alignment. Something nagged at him, a small dissonance he could not dismiss. The pattern had been laid bare, the professor had confessed, but a faint, almost imperceptible detail remained unresolved. His gaze fell on the mirror once more, and this time it was not the smear but the reflection itself that caught his attention. A shadow, lingering at an angle that should have been empty. He rose slowly, stepping back into the corridor. The passengers watched him, curiosity mixed with residual anxiety. "Sir?" the Countess ventured. "I believe," he said quietly, "that we have not seen the entire picture. The professor's confession explains the method and the motive, but it does not account for one very particular detail, the disappearance of the letter opener, nor the attempted attack on the merchant with such calculated timing. Someone else was aware of the professor's plan, or perhaps guiding it." The room went still. Whispers ceased. Even the storm seemed to pause, as though awaiting the unfolding of this last revelation. The detective turned his attention to the young wife. Her hands had been clasped tightly around her husband's arm for hours, but now one sleeve caught on the edge of her coat, pulling free to reveal a small, almost imperceptible cut on her palm. It was fresh. He noticed it because of its alignment with the grain of the salt line, the same hand that had apparently discovered the crime, yet never touched the evidence directly, now bore a subtle mark consistent with moving or manipulating the items in the compartment. He regarded her calmly. "Madam, you were the first to raise the alarm and the one who insisted upon summoning attention to the scene. And yet you were also the only person whose movements were entirely unaccounted for during the night." Her eyes widened, lips parting slightly, a flicker of fear flashing across her face. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. The detective continued, measured and deliberate. "You knew of the professor's intentions, did you not? perhaps even assisted him in subtle ways, testing the reactions of the other passengers, moving evidence when it served the plan. The salt, the key, the mirrors were all orchestrated, not merely by the professor, but with your knowledge, to ensure the illusion of impossible circumstance. The young husband's hand went to his wife's arm, a mixture of confusion and incredulity in his expression. She faltered, a slight quiver running through her frame. She stammered, the mask of innocence cracking. The little gentleman's gaze was steady, indeed. The professor acted on compulsion, yes, but you provided the guidance, the means to hide and manipulate. Your knowledge allowed him to act with precision, to misdirect the authorities, and to nearly escape detection entirely. You were the invisible hand behind the visible acts. A stunned silence filled the carriage. Even the countess and the military officer seemed to sense the sudden shift. The snow pressed harder against the windows, the carriage groaning under the weight of the storm, as if echoing the tension inside. The young wife's shoulders slumped, the pretense gone. "I only wanted to protect my own position," she admitted in a trembling voice. "I did not intend the death." The detective inclined his head, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. "Intent can be as dangerous as action, madam. And now, at last, the entire pattern is revealed. The mastermind is not merely the one who strikes, but the one who guides, the one who observes and directs from the shadows. The case is complete." In that instant, the Snowbound Express, isolated from the world, seemed to exhale. Inside, the layers of deception, manipulation, and hidden motives lay fully exposed, leaving only the stillness of truth and the subtle genius of the detective who had unraveled it all. The passengers sat in stunned silence, the revelation of the young wife's involvement sending a shiver through the carriage. The professor, now quiet and subdued, was escorted by the conductor and the doctor, his earlier bravado completely extinguished. Yet the detective's mind was not on triumph but on clarity, on ensuring that every thread of the complex tapestry was accounted for. He stood slowly, surveying the faces before him. "You have witnessed," he began, voice calm and precise, "how a pattern of seemingly trivial details, subtle gestures, and hidden knowledge can obscure the truth. Each participant played a role, but only one orchestrated the movements, guided the timing, and manipulated perception to her advantage. You may not have seen it, but it was always there, in plain sight for the observant eye." He motioned toward the compartments. The salt line was not mere symbolism, nor was the mirror smear an accident. The abrasion at the door, the misalignment of the key, the disappearance of the letter opener, all were manipulated deliberately. The professor acted on obsession, yes, but he was guided, enabled, and misdirected. The young wife's small gestures, her timing in raising alarm, the subtle marking on her hand, all of these revealed her participation to one who observed carefully. The passengers listened, wide-eyed, the storm outside masking the stillness of revelation inside. Some leaned back, incredulous, others whispered, realizing how the web of deception had been woven around them. Yet as the little gentleman's words traced the outlines of truth, a sudden realization flickered in his mind. He turned toward the young wife, who now sat rigid, eyes wide, jaw tense. There was no grand confession forthcoming, no elaborate scheme of surrender. She had calculated risk and outcome, and she had already taken measures to protect herself. In the chaos of revelation, she slipped a small note into her coat pocket, unnoticed by anyone, and in that fleeting moment, she made her choice. The detective's gaze lingered a fraction too long elsewhere, and when he turned back, she was gone. The compartment door, already unguarded, swung quietly in the wind, the faint sound lost among the howling blizzard. A subtle thrill of frustration passed through him, tempered by admiration for her cunning. She had played her hand with precision, and now she had vanished into the storm beyond, leaving only the echo of her cleverness behind. He moved to the window and watched the snowflakes whip against the tracks, obscuring the path outside. The professor would face justice. The pattern of the crime had been revealed, and yet one crucial participant remained at large, a reminder that even in triumph, human cunning can elude the grasp of law and order. Turning back to the other passengers, he allowed a faint smile. "You see, justice is often served in degrees. The obvious culprit is apprehended, but the true mastermind, sometimes the shadows hide them longer than we wish. Still, every detail, every inconsistency, every subtle gesture is a message. Observation is the most precise form of authority. Even when the criminal escapes, they leave traces for those attentive enough to notice. He gestured to the compartments, the salt trail, the small smear on the mirror, the carefully displaced key. These were the signs overlooked, dismissed as inconsequential. Yet together they told the story: obsession, manipulation, control, and the clever diversion of perception. You see now why one must always watch, always listen, and always think beyond what appears obvious. The passengers remained silent, absorbing the weight of the detective's explanation. The snow outside softened, the storm gradually easing, but inside, a lingering tension remained, a mixture of relief and unease. One criminal was in custody, yet the one who had guided events from the shadows had vanished, leaving an unsettling sense that the game was not fully concluded. The little gentleman stepped back, eyes calm, composed. Justice had been delivered where it could be, the crime unraveled with patient observation, and yet, as always, the mind that orchestrates from the shadows may remain beyond reach. He knew the world was full of such cleverness, of hidden motives and unseen hands, and he was ready always to follow where they left their traces, no matter how faint, no matter how cunning the deception. The Snowbound Express continued its journey, carrying with it the quiet certainty that the truth, however elusive, had been glimpsed, and that the observer's mind would always remain one step ahead. The train had slowed to a cautious pace as the storm finally began to ease, the snow settling in thick drifts along the tracks. The little gentleman walked slowly down the aisle, observing the passengers. Relief and lingering tension mingled on their faces and whispered quietly to one another, while others stared out the windows at the white expanse, still processing the events of the past hours. Yet in the detective's mind, the story was never truly finished. Even with the professor secured and the young wife vanished, a small unease persisted. He paused at compartment 7, the scene of so many revelations. The salt trail remained faintly visible, the key perfectly aligned, and the mirror bore only the subtle ghost of a smear. Everything seemed accounted for, but his sharp eye noticed a tiny detail that had not fit the pattern completely. A single thread, pale as snow, caught on the latch of the door. It was delicate, almost trivial, yet somehow familiar, reminiscent of the fabric used in the young wife's coat. He crouched, lifting the thread carefully, turning it over between his fingers. The implication was clear: the young wife had left more behind than anyone realized. This minor, almost imperceptible trace suggested that she had planned her disappearance meticulously. But it also hinted that she might return, or at least that her influence on the events of the train was not yet entirely concluded. The thought was unsettling, yet exhilarating, a puzzle piece left in plain sight, teasing at an unseen continuation. The little gentleman stood and moved toward the dining car, his footsteps measured, his mind reflecting on every nuance of the case. He had unraveled patterns of deception, motives buried under years of obsession, and the delicate interplay of multiple participants in a single, deadly orchestration. And yet, the lingering mystery of the vanished mastermind reminded him that no case is ever truly closed. Each revelation leaves another question behind, another shadow to follow. Passengers had begun to gather their belongings, the train preparing to arrive at its next station. Conversations were muted, punctuated by cautious glances, as though everyone half expected the unexpected. The detective observed them, noting the subtle relaxation of the shoulders, the faint traces of anxiety still etched in their posture. In their relief, he recognized the human desire to cling to closure, even when the truth remains partial, incomplete. As he reached the vestibule, he paused, looking back at the now empty compartments. The snow outside glimmered under a pale moonlight that had emerged after the storm, casting long shadows along the tracks. The thread in his hand, a silent clue, seemed almost to shimmer with promise, an open-ended signal that another mystery might be waiting somewhere ahead, just out of sight. He tucked the thread carefully into his coat pocket, a token of unresolved questions, and allowed himself a faint smile. It was the nature of his work. The conclusion of one case always brings the anticipation of the next. Even the most meticulous planning and the most confounding patterns cannot extinguish the endless human capacity for intrigue, for secrets, for subtle manipulations. The passengers boarded the station platform at last, the train slowing to a halt. The little gentleman stepped lightly down, the wind carrying snowflakes across the tracks. He paused, surveying the station, a place now quiet yet brimming with possibilities. The professor would face justice, the immediate danger had passed, but the lingering question, the hidden thread of events remained. It would whisper, beckon, and perhaps resurface when least expected. With a composed turn, the detective walked into the night, footsteps soft on the fresh snow. Behind him, the Snowbound Express rested in silence, a world temporarily at peace, yet filled with echoes of intrigue. He knew the answers had been found for now, but also that mysteries never truly end. And as the crisp night air brushed his face, he welcomed the quiet thrill of anticipation. Somewhere, out there, another puzzle waited, subtle, intricate, and challenging enough to test the sharpest mind once more.